Going into neurosurgery.
Going into neurosurgery. So basically, what I'm going to talk about sort of broadly about the kinds of things I do and the way I sort of conceive of surgery. We'll sort of talk about things, somewhat from a technical standpoint, but also from a more philosophical standpoint. Because a lot of that actually enters into the decision making that we sort of go through every day. So the topic of my talk, or the title of my talk, is basically Complete Idiot's Guide to Brain Surgery. These are three complete idiots. There's a lot of sort of popular misconceptions generally, or really popular conceptions of neurosurgeons, sort of conceited, a little haughty, they date their interns, whatever. There's an extent to which some of that's true, some of the reputation has been earned, some of it hasn't. It's not all like this. So I'm going to basically talk a little bit about what I do and my own personal conception of being a neurosurgeon. But
Are you the McDreamy or the McSteamy of NYU?
well, I guess if I were to assign characters in the story, I would be McDreamy. But, I feel more like her sometimes. Anyway, so basically, I'm going to tell you a little story about what I did last weekend, actually. So my fiance took me on this weekend getaway to northern Massachusetts. We went to this little bed and breakfast. Of course, me, the city slicker there with a black hoodie. That's about as comfortable as I looked all day, sitting on a horse there. So this beautiful bucolic setting, bed and breakfast, all these beautiful rolling hills in northern Massachusetts. So, I sit down to breakfast with the proprietor and his wife. The proprietor is this sort of grizzly-looking, guy with a hoodie and kind of a beard and gray hair. So his, he raises horses for a living. His wife comes in. She's like, oh, what do you do for a living? And she's cooking me breakfast. I'm like, well, I'm a neurosurgeon. Most people, when I say that, they're like, oh, you're a neurologist. And I don't know, that's kind of like, nothing against neurologists, but that's sort of, I'm like, always like, oh, no, I'm a neurosurgeon, it's a little different. But she was like, oh, neurosurgeon, that's great. My grandfather was a neurosurgeon. I was like, really? So he's like, so she tells me that basically her grandfather was this guy, Walter Penfield, who is, I'm sure some of you come across his work, but basically he's probably the most, that's sort of the father of modern neurosurgery. For me, my fiance is actually, she once worked in jewelry. So I told her that was the equivalent of saying, oh, you want to work in jewelry? My grandfather was Tiffany. So this guy was basically, star athlete at Princeton. I actually think he went on to be a coach briefly at Princeton, the football team. But he was a particularly bright guy. What this guy did was, he was responsible for a lot of major advances in neurosurgery. He pioneered a procedure called the Montreal procedure, which is basically involves direct electrical stimulation of the brain in order to essentially elicit seizures. And what he was able to do was essentially delineate, because a seizure is essentially overexcitation of neurons in the brain. That's essentially what it is. So through this sort of crude manner, it's crude but elegant. Basically what he did was able to map out the focus of the seizure and delineate it and be able to take it out. So he actually stopped a lot of seizures that way. He's actually he developed a whole set of instruments that I use every single day. So I told her, I use your grandfather's name like 4 times a day. I mean, Penfield 1, Penfield 3, when he's I was sort of starstruck in there. This is one of the things that he was famous for developing, the homunculus. Utilizing that same technique of direct stimulation, what he was able to do essentially was map out what parts of the brain control what functions in the body. So he was able to sort of map this whole thing out. And this is when we study this in medical school, there's sort of a mnemonic, actually in residency, there's a mnemonic we use called FATL, F-A-T-L, which basically shows you where along the cortex you're going to end up finding different parts of the body and the representations. So here would be face, arm, trunk, leg. So fatal. That's the way we learned it. It's interesting because if you look at it, there's almost an overrepresentation of the things that are highly sensitive. So things like the mouth, things like the thumb, the hand. That's overrepresented. So actually, if you drew or if you made a model of a man, of a person that was sort of commensurate with the amount of representation in the brain and the cortex, it would look like that. Sort of interesting. So Dr. Penfield was actually inquisitive not only regarding scientific principles, but he was sort of a spiritual guy as well. So he wanted to find sort of what was the connection between the mind, the body, and the spirit. And this was actually a picture that his granddaughter gave me that she took of his property. There's a huge rock in his backyard, which basically looked like a brain, so he painted it. And so this is nosh. It's like a Greek word meaning mind, but it has sort of an extra element of seeing, of perception. So it's a little more than just than brain. So what he was trying to look for was a connection between mind, between knowledge, and the brain itself, and what was it that makes us inherently human. One thing that was interesting about what she told me that later in life he actually painted these little things through it, these little hash marks. So I mean, I don't know exactly what that means, but then I sort of lost faith in the quest late in life, but I thought this was really interesting. I mean, obviously this is something that's really been bothering people for a long time, and I guess, this particular discussion is not really my place to talk about sort of mind-body duality or that sort of thing. I'm sure that's going to be covered up in some of the other talks you're going to be talking about, or you're going to be participating in. But I still think it's an interesting question for us, because we're making a lot of very tangible connections and disruptions in the system that we honestly don't fully understand. I think we understand a good understanding of how the liver works, how the heart works, but we really don't have a good conception of how the brain works. So I think this whole mind-body duality thing is actually a very interesting concept. And it's something, honestly, that comes up often in my work. What is it that makes us a person unique? If I'm looking at, a piece of brain, and I start, taking it out, when I'm looking at, trying to take out a tumor or something like that, am I going to change who that person is, their character, their spirit? I mean, these are kinds of things that end up coming up a lot. Descartes talked a little bit about the body, and he wanted to have this sort of mind-body sort of duality, right? So he thought of the body as being something that was material, something that was basically governed by the principles and laws of nature. Whereas the spirit, he sort of conceived of as being somewhat separate from that, and as being immaterial, not governed by the laws of nature. So that was sort of this dichotomy, and actually what he tried to do was, through his philosophy, obviously it had broader implications with regard to free will and determinism and that sort of thing. Are we just automatons, a collection of neurons, or is it something else? And he obviously did believe there was something else, this animus. And does anyone know where he found the convergence of mind-body?
Pineal gland?
Yeah, pineal gland, exactly. So that is, there, right? That's the pineal gland. So it's sort of unclear why it wasn't chose this exact organ. I mean, there are different sort of conceptions that he may have chosen it because it's deep. Things that are deep in the brain. Obviously it's important. It abuts the ventricular system, which is basically this area in here where cerebrospinal fluid sort of bathes the brain and the spinal cord. He thought that maybe this is the mechanism by which the mind controlled the body and controlled neurons through cerebrospinal fluid. He actually also thought it was a singular gland, one of the only singular glands in the brain and the body. It actually is not. We know that's not true, but I mean it was part of the reason. Any of you guys know what the function, at least as we've determined it, of the pineal gland is?
Sleep-wake cycles?
Yeah. So it secretes the melatonin and it's involved in sleep cycles, exactly. Just because we clone genes, map pathways, sort of identify different cellular mechanisms of the body and the brain, doesn't necessarily mean that we really know how the brain works. Which actually doesn't really stop us a lot of times from certain treatments. So this is one example would be antipsychotics. This is haldol-quetiapine. Okay, these are great antipsychotics. They can help people that are floridly psychotic and lead reasonably normal lives, control their psychotic symptoms. This was actually discovered by accident. It's one of these things that was initially given during anesthesia for patients that were psychotic just to calm them down. It was found that it had this other property, which is actually a lot of this sort of accident thing happens a lot in medicine. We oftentimes things will come up and we'll discover either a side effect or something that has a beneficial property that ends up being the reason that we end up using it. Something probably more close to home for me, regarding something that we don't really understand. There's this general observation amongst surgeons, amongst neurosurgeons, that if you do something that one frontal lobe, okay, that's the frontal lobe up there, that's a tumor up there. You take out part of the frontal lobe. It's generally considered something you can do with impunity, somewhat. People tend to come out okay. Both frontal lobes, okay, as in the case of finance gauge here, I'm sure you've talked about at some point, right? Or in this case, this was a tumor that was basically causing pressure and swelling on both frontal lobes. These patients, for some reason, come out a lot different, and it's not exactly clear why that is. You can make up some argument about, something about the connection between the frontal lobes and some associative thing, but it's not really well delineated why that is. Why would be the case that somebody with only a unilateral frontal lobe lesion would have most of the capacities of their personality and such intact after some sort of procedure, whereas people that have both their frontal lobes messed up end up coming out very, very different. They come out abulic, right, lack of will and grief, or oftentimes with their personality completely different, like as in the case of Fighting Escape, which is probably actually for historical purposes somewhat exaggerated. I mean, that's at least what I heard from the people that knew Fighting Escape personally. Basically, I think, given our relative lack of understanding and knowledge about this, I think that in general, being a doctor, being a neurosurgeon is actually somewhat of a humbling experience. I mean, how many of you heard this, that we only use 10% of our brain? I mean, what sense does that really make from like an evolutionary standpoint, or God, or who would create something that was you're only going to use 10%, right? So the more likely thing is that we don't understand 90% what it does. All right. Obviously this is very valuable real estate. The brain is enclosed in a protective casing. It's in a very thick skull. It is separated from the rest of the body and the rest of the body fluids by a blood-brain barrier, which actually makes it a lot of times very difficult for us to treat the brain, like when you're doing chemotherapy and all. You have to actually devise ways almost to trick the body into letting things into the brain. So the brain, it represents only about 3% of the body weight. It uses about 20% of the body's energy. So clearly, this is something that has great evolutionary significance. I think that generally when we treat this, and we have to sort of attach a commensurate amount of respect to it, right? There has been a lot of stuff written about it, a lot of journals out there, a lot of talk about the doctors as scientists and whatnot, and I think that's only sort of partly true. Medicine is kind of a messy science. You can sort of isolate a proton or something and throw it through an accelerator, or you can isolate a cell. But I think once you start to once you start to try to describe a system as complex as the human body, or describe processes as complex as the disease processes that affect us, it starts to get messy, and it's difficult to have true control groups and to pursue the scientific method in the most rigorous way. The way that we know. I think that a lot of medical science really does end up being manipulation of statistics, which is not to say that great things haven't been done. Great things have obviously been done in medicine, but I just think that the disease processes and such are just too multifactorial, really, to describe accurately the true scientific sense. So I think that in general, there is a great deal of creativity actually that goes into being a doctor. It's sort of like, I consider medicine a science in the same way that philosophy is a science. You have certain rules that govern, like let's say logic or whatever, but if you take these rules and sort of follow them rigidly without any respect for sort of common sense or street smarts in some ways, right? You can end up sort of running yourself into something that doesn't make any sense at all, right? So I think the same thing is true in medicine. Obviously, there are things you need to learn, or basic tenets, basic funds of knowledge that you need to acquire in order to be a doctor. But a lot of this ends up being creative in the way that you can sort of think outside the box. Street smarts, honestly, because surgery ends up being a very highly creative field. A lot of times we're sitting there trying to figure out what's the best way to get there, how are we going to, and sort of almost thinking on the fly. So one of the places that I really learned this at was Bellevue, all right? Bellevue is a crazy place. You see patients with all kinds of crazy stuff, very advanced stages of disease. People would come in sometimes off the plane with their MRIs, being like, oh, I was told just to bring my MRI from Guatemala or something, being like, I was told to bring my MRI to Bellevue and come to the ER. We would a lot of times see patients in here, like, with this thing, this is actually funny. So patients would come in all the time saying things like, oh, I was minding my own business and someone just, came up and shot me, or like, I was minding my own business and somebody came over and all started beating me up. Or like my favorite was, I was minding my own business and the cops just started chasing me on the rooftop and I fell down between the buildings and all. So we had a joke that minding your own business was the most dangerous activity in New York City. Anybody who's squeamish, now would be the time to close your eyes. So this is basically a 25-year-old kid that jumped off the second floor, out of the second story of a building. He impaled himself on a fence, came in walking, talking normal, okay? The FDNY basically had to cut out that fence, all right? So, what do you do here? Obviously, I'm not looking for like a surgical answer, right? But what are the kinds of things you think about when you're confronted with this, right? You can see how far into the brain this thing is, right? So anyone have any ideas about like what you would do? Just run up and pull it out,